The Texan sky, a crucible of fire, was already blazing when Dusty Callahan emerged from his small weathered cabin. The air, still holding the night's crispness, carried the mingled scents of sagebrush and damp earth. His boots marked a familiar cadence on the gravel path as he headed towards the corrals. Rusty, his grizzled border collie, uncurled from a patch of shade, offering a tail-wagging, expectant greeting. Patch, the calico barn cat, observed from a fence post, emerald slits for eyes in the burgeoning light. "Morning, boys," Dusty rumbled, his voice a low timbre as he stroked Rusty's head before tossing feed into Patch's bowl. This sprawling ranch, beneath the boundless heavens, was his universe. Every weathered fence post, the rhythmic squeal of the windmill, each sun-baked stone bore witness to his unrelenting toil. His movements were a study in quiet efficiency, inspecting the horses, mending a loose plank, economical and strong. The desert served as his silent confidant, the livestock his kin. He often found profound beauty in the morning light's embrace of the distant mesas, or the intricate dance of a hawk spiraling high above. "Mr. Callahan, I brought you a fresh apple pie." The voice, a touch too sweet for the early hour, drifted from the dust track leading to his homestead. Dusty let out an almost imperceptible sigh. It was Martha Higgins, the baker's daughter, her plump silhouette framed against the nascent sun, a checkered cloth concealing a warm pie. He offered a polite nod. "That's mighty kind of you, Martha, but I've just finished breakfast." Martha's smile wavered, yet she pressed on. "I also noticed that tear in your work shirt last Sunday. I could mend it for you, no trouble at all." "Thank you, but I'm perfectly capable with a needle and thread," Dusty replied, his tone firm yet gentle. He watched her retreat, the pie still clutched in her hands. A familiar scene. This wasn't the first, nor would it be the last. A steady procession of women from Cactus Creek seemed drawn to his quiet strength and the air of mystery that clung to him like the desert dust. There was Sarah, who presented him with freshly laundered handkerchiefs, and Eleanor, who attempted to engage him in lengthy discourses on local wildflowers. He always expressed his gratitude, always declined, and always remained an unbreachable wall of polite detachment. He watched the sun paint the distant hills in shifting hues of ochre and rose. He recognized the yearning in their eyes, the unspoken invitations of companionship and comfort. But for him, love was a distraction, a soft entanglement that threatened to pull him from the unforgiving earth, the relentless sun, the silent communion he shared with the wind. The desert demanded his undivided attention, his unwavering allegiance. He believed that the tender blossoms of affection would inevitably wither beneath the harsh realities of his solitary existence. And he had no desire to witness their struggle. His life here, intertwined with the vast, tranquil wilderness, was complete, more than complete. The dust cloud, a familiar companion to any traveler approaching Cactus Creek, was thicker than usual. Within it, a wagon, surprisingly laden with crates rather than supplies, rumbled towards the cluster of sun-baked buildings. Perched atop the driver's seat, a woman with a wide-brimmed hat and an even wider, hopeful smile guided the team. Miss Clara Meadows, newly arrived from the greener pastures of Missouri, surveyed her new domain. Her crates, carefully cushioned with straw, contained not bolts of fabric or sacks of flour, but books, hundreds of them, their spines promising worlds beyond the arid plains. The schoolhouse, a small whitewashed structure on the edge of town, felt strangely cool when she stepped inside the next morning. The air hummed with anticipation, quickly replaced by the nervous shuffles of small feet. Clara greeted each child by name, a feat she'd managed to accomplish from the town roster the previous evening. She spoke of stories, of numbers that sang, and of a world waiting to be discovered within the pages of her numerous books. A small boy, no older than 6, asked, "Are you going to make us read all of 'em, ma'am?" Clara's laugh was bright, a melody new to the quiet schoolhouse. "Only the ones that call to you, young man, and perhaps a few more that you didn't know were calling." The children, initially wary, found themselves drawn into her gentle but firm orbit. Dusty Callahan, leaning against the rail of the general store, watched the procession of parents picking up their children later that afternoon. He'd seen a few school teachers come and go in his time, usually timid little things who couldn't stand the heat or the isolation. This one, however, seemed different. She moved with an unhurried grace, her gaze meeting the townspeople's with an unblinking directness that wasn't aggressive, merely observant. He'd noticed her earlier, bargaining with Old Man Hemlock over the price of kindling, her voice clear and without a trace of the usual feminine simpering that grated on his nerves. She'd pointed out a dry rot patch on one of the logs, then offered a price a good 20% lower than Hemlock's initial demand. And Hemlock, usually as stubborn as a mule, had conceded, albeit grudgingly. As she walked by the general store, a stray gust of wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. She smoothed it back with a practical, unadorned hand, her eyes briefly meeting Dusty's. There was no coy flutter, no bashful retreat. Just a level, assessing glance that seemed to take him in, process him, and then move on without judgment or an ounce of flirtation. It was unsettlingly refreshing. Dusty, usually adept at ignoring the fairer sex, found himself following her with his gaze until she disappeared behind the schoolhouse door. There was a quiet strength about her, an independence that set her apart from any woman he'd encountered in Cactus Creek. And he, the Lone Star, found himself intrigued, a sensation as foreign as a spring shower in the middle of summer. The familiar cadence of hooves on the dusty track announced Dusty's morning patrol. He didn't glance up, his gaze fixed on the horizon as always. But a flash of movement from the meadow's porch caught his eye. Miss Clara, a splash of lavender against the weathered wood, raised a hand in a small, unhurried wave. It wasn't a flamboyant gesture, no enthusiastic arm flapping, just a simple, almost regal lift of her hand, a quiet acknowledgement of his passage. Dusty, without breaking his stride or altering his stoic expression, offered a barely perceptible nod in return. A flicker, gone as quickly as it appeared, but enough. Later that afternoon, a splintered post on the northern pasture fence proved stubborn. Dusty wrestled with it, the wood groaning under his efforts. He swore under his breath, the air thick with frustration and the scent of pine. A shadow fell across the sun-drenched field. Miss Clara, clad in a practical linen dress, approached carrying a coil of new wire and a pair of heavy-duty pliers. She didn't speak, didn't ask if he needed help, just knelt beside the broken section and began to expertly thread the new wire through the existing strands, her movements precise and efficient. Dusty watched her, a strange mix of surprise and grudging admiration simmering within him. He usually worked alone, the silence of familiar companion. Her presence, however, wasn't intrusive. It was cooperative. After a few minutes, he picked up his hammer, their efforts falling into an unspoken rhythm. The fence was mended in half the time. That evening, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues, Dusty found himself leaning against his porch rail, a lukewarm cup of coffee forgotten in his hand. He hadn't thought about mending fences or cattle all afternoon. Instead, his mind kept replaying Miss Clara's easy laugh earlier in the day, when the neighborhood children had chased a runaway ball into her yard. It was a sound that carried, light and unburdened, a stark contrast to the usual quiet that enveloped his own life. He pictured her hands, surprisingly strong, deftly twisting the fence wire. He wondered what she was doing now. The thought, unbidden and persistent, lingered, a small, warm spark in the quiet expanse of his solitary existence. He found himself anticipating tomorrow's ride, if only for that brief, quiet wave. The wind, sharp and unforgiving, bit at Dusty's exposed skin as he dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen earth. The last sliver of an orange sun bled into the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. He'd spent the day pushing strays back to the main herd, a thankless task that left his muscles aching and his spirit threadbare. The cabin ahead, a dark silhouette against the fading light, offered no welcome. No curl of smoke from the chimney, no warm glow from a window. Just the silent promise of cold walls and an empty hearth. Inside, the chill seeped into his bones. He fumbled for a match, the sudden flare illuminating a single, dusty room. The air was still, thick with the scent of old wood and neglect. He lit a lantern, its weak light casting long dancing shadows that only deepened the quiet. His supper was a predictable affair. Cold beans from a can, scooped directly from the tin. Each mouthful was a bland punctuation mark in the vast silence. He ate slowly, listening to the creaks of the cabin, the sigh of the wind through the eaves, sounds that only amplified the emptiness. A profound weariness settled over him, heavier than any physical exertion. It wasn't just the day's labor, it was the steady drip of days, weeks, years spent in this solitary rhythm. He looked around the small space, at the unmade cot, the worn saddle slung over a chair, the stack of dog-eared books he rarely touched. There was no life here beyond his own, no echo of another's presence. The realization, stark and sudden, felt like a cold hand on his chest. He pushed the can aside, the clatter startlingly loud in the quiet. The thought of another night, alone with his thoughts and the ceaseless wind, was unbearable. An unfamiliar tug, a yearning he rarely acknowledged, pulled at him. He needed to see a human face, hear a voice that wasn't his own internal monologue. Without conscious decision, he rose, retrieved his hat, and strode out into the deepening twilight. The town, a distant flicker of lamplight against the black, called to him with an almost desperate urgency. He swung back onto his horse, the familiar creak of the saddle, a small comfort in the vast, enveloping night. He spurred the animal forward, leaving the silent cabin behind, drawn by an unknown force towards the faint promise of warmth and connection. Dusty rode into Harmony Springs, the last sliver of twilight painting the western sky in bruised purples and fading oranges. The town, usually a silhouette against the setting sun, now glowed with scattered lamplight. His gaze, habitually sweeping the familiar storefronts and dusty road, snagged on a single, unwavering beacon. Miss Clara's window. A warm, inviting square of golden light spilled onto the porch, a stark contrast to the deepening gloom elsewhere. It wasn't just a lamp. It felt like a silent invitation, a soft hum amidst the quiet of the evening. He dismounted before the livery, his movements precise, practiced. But as he secured Traveler, an unfamiliar hesitation prickled at him. He'd intended to head straight home, cook a solitary supper, and fall into his well-worn routine. Yet his boots, seemingly with a will of their own, turned not towards his small cabin, but down the short lane leading to Miss Clara's cottage. A shyness he hadn't felt since he was a gangly boy, fumbling for words in front of the schoolmarm, tightened his chest. It was a peculiar sensation, this flutter of nerves, for a man who faced down wild mustangs and rogue cattle without a second thought. The gate creaked a soft welcome as he pushed it open. The scent of honeysuckle, heavy and sweet, drifted from the trellis beside the porch. As he approached, the source of the golden glow became clear. Miss Clara sat in a wicker chair, a book open in her lap, the lamplight illuminating the delicate curve of her cheek and the silver strands woven into her dark hair. She wasn't aware of him yet, lost in the world within the pages. There was a quiet grace to her, a stillness that drew him in. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unexpectedly loud in the hushed evening. Her head lifted, her eyes, the color of moss after a spring rain, meeting his. A soft smile touched her lips, genuine and unhurried. "Evening, Dusty," she said, her voice a low, melodious murmur that seemed to perfectly fit the tranquility of the moment. "Miss Clara," he managed, his voice huskier than he intended. He felt a blush creep up his neck, a ridiculous reaction, and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Just passing by." It was a clumsy lie, and they both knew it. The last embers of the sunset painted the western sky in hues of tangerine and bruised purple. Clara, a silhouette against the fading light, gently swayed on the porch swing, a book resting unread in her lap. "Dusty," she called out softly, her voice carrying easily on the still air. "The stars are coming out. Care to join me?" Dusty, who had been meticulously coiling a lasso by the corral fence, paused. He glanced at her, then at the vast, darkening expanse above. He usually preferred the solitude of his evening chores, the predictable rhythm of his hands. Yet something in her invitation, the quiet warmth of it, pulled him. He hung the lasso on its peg, and with a subtle shift in his posture that betrayed a hint of unease, made his way to the porch. The old swing creaked a welcoming protest as he settled in beside her, leaving a respectful, if slightly awkward, space between them. "They're a sight, aren't they?" Clara murmured, her gaze fixed upwards. "So many of them. Each one a story, I imagine." Dusty grunted, a sound that could have meant agreement or merely acknowledgement. "Never seen 'em like this anywhere else," he finally offered, his voice a low rumble. "Clearer out here. No city lights to drown 'em out." "No," she agreed, her tone thoughtful. "Just the vastness. It makes you feel small, but in a good way, doesn't it? Like you're part of something much bigger." She turned her head slightly to face him. "Do you read much, Dusty?" He shifted, uncomfortable with the direct question. "Only what's necessary. Ranch ledgers, the newspaper sometimes." Clara smiled, a gentle knowing curve of her lips. "I don't mean that kind of reading. I mean stories, adventures, other worlds." She gestured to the book in her lap. This one's about a man who sails the globe, discovering new lands. Bahumahum. Dusty considered this. Never had much time for such things. Perhaps not, Clara said, her voice soft but firm. But there's a different kind of discovery in books. A quiet one, inside your own head. She paused, then added, just like there's a quiet beauty to this desert. Most folks see only dust and desolation. But look closer, and there's a whole world thriving. The way the light catches the mesquite at dawn, the tenacity of a cactus flower, the sound of the wind through the canyons. He found himself listening, truly listening. Her words painted pictures he'd seen 1,000 times, but never articulated, never felt quite so deeply. He had always appreciated the desert in his own stoic way, its stark honesty, its demanding rhythms. But Clara, with her gentle observations, was giving it voice, giving it poetry. A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. He felt a loosening in his chest, a subtle unwinding of the knots he hadn't realized were there. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she spoke them, without judgment, without expectation. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Dusty felt seen, understood. Not as the rancher, not as the lone star, but simply as Dusty. A connection as clear and bright as the stars emerging above them had begun to form. He found himself wishing the night would never end. The last embers of the campfire pulsed with a faint orange glow, mirroring the distant stars that now dominated the ink-black sky. The moon, a pearly orb, had climbed high above the jagged silhouette of the mountains, signaling the late hour. Dusty had been recounting a particularly harrowing run-in with a badger while mending fence, his deep voice a low rumble in the quiet night. Clara listened, her gaze unwavering, a soft smile playing on her lips. She seemed to absorb every word, every nuance of his rugged tales. He finished, clearing his throat, a faint blush rising to his weathered cheeks. He wasn't used to such an attentive audience, especially not one so captivating. He'd braced himself for her usual insightful comment about animal psychology or the resilience of nature. Instead, her sparkling eyes reflecting the moonlight fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Dusty," she began, her voice a gentle current in the stillness, "do you want a wife or a lonely life?" The directness of the question hit him like a physical blow, stripping away the comfortable layers of their easy companionship. The air crackled with a sudden, unexpected tension. He felt a tremor deep within him, a tremor he usually reserved for a rattlesnake's warning or a stampede's distant thunder. He looked away, his gaze sweeping across the vast, empty expanse of the desert, where mesquite trees stood like solitary sentinels, and the wind whispered ancient secrets. It was a landscape he knew intimately, a landscape that mirrored his own solitary existence. He'd always told himself he preferred it this way. No complications, no expectations, just the rhythm of the land and the quiet satisfaction of hard work. But now, as his eyes drifted back to Clara, to the warmth radiating from her, to the subtle curve of her smile, the desert suddenly seemed cold. The vastness felt less like freedom and more like an endless, echoing void. His heart, usually a steady, predictable drum, hammered against his ribs. He saw her patience, her unwavering belief in him, the way she saw past his gruff exterior to something he barely acknowledged himself. The question hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as a genuine, almost tender inquiry. It was a choice, stark and undeniable, laid bare under the silent judgment of the moon. The crisp evening air, usually a balm to Dusty's solitary soul, now carried an unfamiliar tremor. Clara's question, delivered with her characteristic blend of gentleness and directness, still echoed in the quiet canyon. "Do you want a wife or a lonely life?" It wasn't a demand nor a plea, but an invitation, laid bare and honest. For years the thought of a companion had been a fleeting shadow, easily dismissed. He'd built his life around self-sufficiency, around the vast, silent stretches of land that answered to no one. But now, a new feeling bloomed in his chest, warm and insistent, like a desert flower after a long-awaited rain. It wasn't just the warmth of a fire on a cold night. It was something deeper, a yearning he hadn't known he possessed. He looked at her, truly looked. The fading light caught the subtle humor in her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth, the way her hair, freed from its usual pins, caught the breeze. She wasn't trying to change him, but rather offering a different path, one where companionship wasn't a burden, but a shared journey. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hoot of an owl and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. This wasn't about convenience or obligation. It was about connection, about the quiet strength he saw reflected in her gaze. Slowly, deliberately, Dusty reached out. His calloused fingers, usually adept at reins and ropes, trembled slightly as they closed around her hand. Her skin was soft, yet resilient, a fitting metaphor for the woman herself. A wide, unburdened smile, one that hadn't graced his face in years, spread across his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. It was a smile of acceptance, of surrender to a future he hadn't dared to imagine. Clara's answering smile was radiant, a quiet triumph that held no hint of arrogance. She didn't speak, didn't press. She simply squeezed his hand, her touch a silent promise. They sat there, side by side on the weathered porch swing, the last vestiges of twilight painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The canyon, once a symbol of his solitary existence, now felt like a sanctuary, ready to witness a new beginning. The air, once a vehicle for his unspoken thoughts, now hummed with a shared understanding, a silent joy that promised to echo through the years to come. The late spring sun, a gentle caress rather than its usual desert inferno, presided over Dusty and Clara's wedding. It wasn't a grand affair. There were no elaborate decorations, no sprawling guest list beyond a handful of ranch hands and Clara's distant cousin from Flagstaff. The ceremony took place beneath the ancient mesquite tree near the creek, its gnarled branches offering dappled shade. Clara, in a simple cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, looked radiant, her eyes sparkling with a joy that softened Dusty's typically stoic expression. He, in his best denim and a freshly pressed white shirt, held her hand with a tenderness that surprised even himself. Reverend Elijah Jones, a traveling preacher who'd found himself stalled in Cactus Creek, spoke of steadfastness and partnership. When Dusty, his voice a low rumble, promised to cherish and protect, Clara squeezed his hand, a silent vow echoing his own. Life on the Callahan Ranch settled into a rhythm, not just of work, but of shared moments. The creak of the old screen door now often heralded Clara's arrival in the barn, a jug of lemonade in hand for Dusty and his men. She learned to mend saddles with surprising dexterity, her small, capable hands stitching leather with focus. Dusty, in turn, found himself explaining the intricacies of herd rotation, pointing out the subtle signs of a healthy calf, and even letting her try her hand at driving the old tractor, a look of amused exasperation on his face as she stalled it for the third time. He watched her, a quiet pride blooming in his chest, as she efficiently managed the ranch accounts, her neat handwriting filling ledgers that had long been sparse and neglected. The silence that had once filled the ranch house was replaced by a symphony of domesticity. The clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen, Clara humming a forgotten tune as she kneaded dough, the low murmur of their voices as they discussed the day's work over supper. Even the wind chimes on the porch, long silent, seemed to sing a happier tune. One evening, as the last sliver of sun painted the western sky in hues of orange and violet, Dusty found himself leaning against the doorframe, watching her, a profound sense of peace settling over him. He'd lived a life defined by solitude, by the vast, empty spaces of his land and heart. Now, his ranch, once a monument to his isolation, thrummed with a new kind of vitality, a warmth that radiated from Clara's presence. Her laughter, clear and bright, echoed from the kitchen as she discovered a particularly stubborn stain on his work shirt. And Dusty smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. The lonely life he'd once contemplated was now a distant, forgotten dream, replaced by the rich, vibrant reality of a shared future.